In this tutorial, we will introduce the model view controller pattern by changing our servlet as the back-end controller and changing the JSPs as the view layer in our charity registration example web app. These are the high-level steps we will follow. First, we'll move all the JSP properties to web.xml, and then we'll change the servlet to use a requestDispatcher to forward to our JSP pages. We will remove all the business logic in the JSP and just have presentation layer logic. And then, of course, we will run and debug our new model view controller web application. And now we are going to visit our course documentation page, and we'll look at how to combine Java and JSP in a MVC pattern. And the first step is to configure our JSP properties in the web.xml. And we have some good links here to existing and older Oracle documentation. And here we see how we define all the properties in the web.xml. This specifies the location of where to apply the JSP properties. This means all JSP files and also all JSP fragment files. Then we have our page encoding as UTF-8, scripting invalid, and here we are including a base JSP fragment file at the top of every page. We specify that we will trim all the white spaces, and the default context type is text.html. Further down here is an overview of best practices to follow when specifying properties for your JSP in the web.xml. And then we are also going to get ahead of ourselves a little bit by importing the core Java standard tag library. We will cover that in a later lesson. Back in Eclipse, under our charity registration, deployed resources, our web.xml, and here is the update for our JSP property group. Now back to our course documentation, and we see that we have the servlet acting as the controller, and we also have to update our JSPs to be pure presentation JSPs, and we move all of our logic into our backend servlet. And we also use the requestDispatcher here to forward to our registration form. Here is the registration form. And here is how we'll update the logic to be a pure MVC pattern with only display logic in the presentation and everything else in the backend servlet. So let's look at it in Eclipse. We have a redirect to the charity registration servlet. We have our charity registration servlet, and we see this is the old code with all the output written inside of the servlet. So we'll have to update that. Here is our file attachment POJO and our registration POJO. Here is the base JSP fragment that we will include everywhere as set up in our properties file. This is our 3 JSP presentation form, creating a registration, listing the registrations, and entering a registration or adding a registration. Now back to our course documentation, and we'll go through this section on changing the servlet to a controller and using the view JSPs. We'll start by changing the show registration to get a requestDispatcher and to forward it to the registration form. And this is the change in our registration form. We use the servlet mapping here to post to. And we look at the view registration. We see the same thing. It's a pure presentation layer with a reference URL to the mapped servlet. And we see that a registration ID and registration is required. So here we have to get the ID parameter and the registration and set it as attributes before we send it onto the view registration. And then finally we have our list registration presentation page. And here we set the registration database before we forward it to the list registrations page. And now back in Eclipse, and we'll take a look at our charity registration servlet. And we see that we expand and change the show registration form method by using the requestDispatcher to forward it to the registration form. We'll no longer output the input form. We do the same thing in the view registration. We forward to the view registration JSP, and we need to get and set the registration ID and the actual registration on the request as an attribute. The download file attachment stays basically the same. Here again with the list registrations, we forward to the list registration and we set the charity registration as a request attribute. The create registration forwards to our charity registration servlet, and our processing file attachment method stays basically the same. And when we get the registration, we also forward to the registration servlet. Obviously, because we have an included header in our properties file, we no longer have to output the header or the footer because we've included this. We also have some debug breakpoints. Here's another one, and another one, and line 75, line 58, line 35. So now we are ready to debug into our charity registration application. And we hit our first breakpoint. We'll hit resume. Here is our landing page with the create registration servlet action down here. So we'll select that and we hit our breakpoint again. Our action value is create. So we go into our show registration form method, and now we'll forward to the JSP form. Here is our input form. We add a dummy text file. Submit. We hit another breakpoint. Our action is create. So we'll go to our create registration. We create a new registration POJO. We set the username and subject from the parameters. We set the body. We add the file. And then we do a synchronized update of the charity registration database and forward to the servlet. So we'll just hit resume here, and inside the process file attachment, we'll resume as well. And here is the entered registration with the name, the body, the attachment, and we can return to our list of registrations, back into our breakpoints, getting the registrations from the database. And here is our list registration page with the number, the subject, and the customer name, and we can restart the process again. And that concludes this tutorial. I will see you in the next one.